Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us and staying for the very final session of the day. Greatly appreciate it. So, my name is Ákos. I'm a senior manager at the Carbon Trust Cities and Regions team, and in this session, we are going to talk about local area energy planning. This is an area that is becoming increasingly important as local authorities move from setting net zero ambitions to figuring out how to actually deliver them. So over the last few years, local area energy plans, or LEAPs for short, have become a key tool for understanding what the transition to net zero might look like. But as more authorities move into second and even third iterations of these plans, an important question is starting to emerge, which is around how do we make these plans generally useful for decision making and delivery. So today, just to put this into a context, we wanted to introduce a project which is called the South East London Energy Plan, or SELEP for short, which is an ongoing collaboration between 4 London boroughs and the Carbon Trust that is exploring some of these questions that I just mentioned. So, rather than focusing solely on technical modeling in these projects, we are also looking at practitioner engagement, organizational realities, and also how local authorities can ultimately turn strategy into action as well. So to explore some of these themes, I'm super delighted to be joined by Cassidy Travis, who's Head of Climate Change and Sustainability at Lambeth Council, and Cassidy has been working very closely with us in this project. So Cassidy, perhaps we can start discussing one of the key questions which I'm guessing many local authorities across the UK are grappling with, which is around why is moving from strategy to delivery often in practice is quite challenging.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks to the audience for hanging around for the last session of the day. As Ákos said, I'm head the climate and sustainability team at Lambeth Council, the borough we're based in now today for the event. This is one of the things we've really appreciated about how we've approached this is that from the outset, that was the challenge, was taking data, taking the analysis, and really looking at why are all the strategies, because we've got loads of strategies not actually kind of delivering on the ground. And I mean, I think from my perspective, there's a few things that have really made it quite difficult for a local authority to deliver. I mean, I think from the outset, the terminology is quite impenetrable. And so I think, we talk about things like electrification pathways and our pathway out to net zero and peak demand and load shifting, and I've immediately lost the room. And we have, as a local authority, we're pretty thin on the ground with resources, and we've got an absolutely massive remit. So, just within the council itself, trying to garner the right support that this is actually really important, the language matters. And so, really making sure that from the outset we're starting to engage our planning departments. What's it mean for what your day job is? Our housing department that have a huge amount of statutory pressures that they're now coming under immediate fire safety, damp and mold, AWIB's law, and now you're coming to me to talk about local area energy planning and heat network zoning. So there is a huge amount of, I think, technical terminology in this space, in our strategies, that make it really difficult for our different departments to actually understand what it means for me and why should I prioritize it when I've got a million other things going on. So I think there's the internal aspect, and then that's not even when you go out and start to look at the other stakeholders which are in the energy system. So we've done quite a few different energy projects, and I can tell you the strategy, which shows a lovely line going this way down to net zero, has nothing to do with what the actual work on the ground is. And I think really looking at some of the higher level trajectories trajectories, and then how that marries with what individual buildings need and what that means for a building, there's a big gap there. And then you also have a lot of other actors within the energy system. So, we were looking to decarbonize our schools and ended up building a substation on one of our playgrounds. That wasn't something that we had kind of anticipated. And the lead times from UKPN to get that done, all of the other factors make the kind of messy reality really, really quite divorced from what some of these strategies have previously set out that might be quite stagnant, might be quite data heavy, and impenetrable in terms of the technology.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. So I mentioned in my intro, it's one of the things we've been exploring through this project, CELEP, is whether leaps can become more grounded in delivery realities and local organizational context as well. So not just technical system modeling, as traditionally this kind of project's been heavily sort of focused on in the past. So alongside all the analytical work that we do as well, we place much greater emphasis on practitioner engagement. We had many interviews scheduled with colleagues and the other borough colleagues, different departments within the local authorities, just to really understand those local opportunities, constraints, and so on. And also, I think one of the other things that we placing an emphasis on is about the transparency of the assumptions that we are using in all the technical modeling side of things as well. So from your perspective, Cassidy, what has stood out so far about this project? I realize we're still about halfway through, so still many things to learn, but if there's anything that you think so far has actually been going pretty well and maybe, compared to the more traditional methods, what's different and what is actually still remain challenging or uncertain as well, that'd be great.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things. So, as I said in the first question is that messy reality. This process has really tried to engage with that messy reality. And so understanding what does our stock look like? What's our actual pipeline for decarbonization? Do we have a boiler to heat pump replacement program? How much of our plans are actually funded? And then really asking each of our departments and the practitioners, what this looks like on paper, can you tell me what the delivery reality is? And so they've looked through a lot of our strategies, our housing stock data, they've looked at heat network plans, but then they've had real conversations with our different departments asking, where are you at in terms of your delivery? And that bit is so often missing. And I think it really does matter when you're creating a plan to engage people from the outset so that their challenges can be reflected within that. And they've done a context analysis across all 4 of the boroughs that are participating. And I'd also say we're really often quite curious what other boroughs are doing. So it's really interesting for us to see a kind of context analysis which breaks down across each of the core sectors, from transport to heat networks to domestic buildings to non-domestic, how we're all doing, because we might have slightly different building profiles and the stock that we manage, but we do have a lot of similarities. And so that's been really interesting as well. And also just to put on paper is how far are we from those really hard fought ones that we've had where we have been making progress, but compared to where our trajectories are, we still have a pretty big gap. It's been really iterative. I think that's been really helpful as well. So, they've asked us the questions and then mirrored it back. Did we get it right? We've had conversations about the assumptions that go into it. The gentleman before who was talking about that black box, that really resonated with me because previous strategies that we've done, we end up providing consultants a huge amount of data. They do some magic in the background. They come back and they go, here's your pathway. And we don't really understand in a meaningful way the choices and trade-offs that you pick if you're going this route. And we're obviously in quite a dynamic environment. You've got new policies coming into play. You might have new funding streams come up, and we've got to respond to that quickly. So it's been really helpful to be very iterative, for it to be really engaging both across departments as well as across multiple boroughs.
Yeah, thanks, Cassidy. And from a delivery point of view, as Carbon Trust delivering this work is also, these early engagements are just so productive, and when it comes to the technical model building as well, and building the model step by step as we're going through these practical iterations and engagement with those local teams, is what the model puts out is actually much more realistic and deliverable, soon as we start building that model, and we just making it more and more and more practical and deliverable as we progress with the project. Another very interesting and one of my favorite parts of this project is that it's being developed across 4 boroughs simultaneously, which I think is quite a unique aspect itself for a LEAP. Traditionally, these LEAPs have been developed quite isolation for individual local authorities. I think, I feel that this is a great approach that's created opportunities not only to compare the different local context, but also identify common challenges, shared priorities, and areas where, collaboration may support the actual delivery as well. So again, based on your experience, Cassidy, what are these values that cross-border collaboration brings into a project like that? And I'm also curious about, how common this collaboration is typically, through administrative boundaries of local authorities. Is it often practical and easy in reality, or is the opposite and is rather challenging often?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is often, just to start with the first question about how often does this happen, I think given how close we are to to our neighbors, Southwark and Lewisham and Greenwich, which are the kind of 4 neighboring boroughs that are all participating in this, we don't do it enough. And there are various forums that are out there where you might engage and you think, oh, this was really useful and I've learned what someone else is doing. And then you put your head down and you go back into into kind of fighting fires and trying to do, balance all the things that you have to do on a day-to-day basis. And I think having a structured project where you're working together brings that we have to come back consistently. We're all invested in the outcome. We actually have a structure in place to be from the outset discussing things which are fundamentally do not respect borough boundaries. And so that's been really helpful. I think there are forums, but as I said, it doesn't happen enough. And I think there's also a degree in which, as we're looking at the potential opportunities, some of the things that are coming out, for example, heat network zoning or strategic energy infrastructure, again, doesn't stop at the borders of Lambeth. And equally, we are quite scarce on resource. And so going into it and having this platform where we're having these really in-depth conversations and providing information and sharing it across boroughs has enabled us then to mobilize much more quickly for opportunities that would require cross-boundary collaboration. So there was recently a national government call for local authorities to come forward and put heat network zones on the national pipeline. Because of this project, we already had those discussions that actually we know there's some areas across our boundaries that we want to work together through shared governance. And so it's already having some of those practical governance and resource mobilization benefits. The other thing is that we have quite a few of us that have also had local elections, and many people that are looking at the time horizons that they're setting for net zero targets. And this is going to be a really critical evidence base that we have to help work out what do we do and how do we prioritize things. And I don't think anyone necessarily has the answer, but it's really helpful to be thinking about that across multiple local authorities, bringing politicians together, because we are absolutely engaging with our councillors and our politicians about the choices and trade-offs made here, and enabling them to have some of those discussions as well at a political level.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned heat networks, for example, several times. And yeah, we do see that in our heat networks projects at the Carbon Trust that more and more local authorities started to work together to exploit these bigger strategic opportunities that often go well beyond an administrative boundary. So that's absolutely a good example, and we see that trend emerge in that sector definitely. So. Of course, much of the work in SELEP is still ongoing. I think we're about halfway through in this project pretty much. But I think even at this stage, perhaps some important reflections that are already emerging, both on the planning process itself and also on how local authorities engage with implementation per se. So yes, as the project continues to develop, what early reflections and lessons do you think it's worth sharing with other local authorities and the audience as well today?
Yeah, I mean, I guess one of the first things at the outset is to get a good partner. And I think we were quite pleased with the procurement process that we ran. We really put this kind of practitioner-led approach at the outset of what we wanted. We really challenged for the procurement process to consider partnerships, consider innovation, and consider how you engage with those really knotty issues around supply chain maturity and that big gap between planning and the kind of financial delivery reality, skills, capability, et cetera. And that was really reflected in the proposal and approach that Carbon Trust put forth. And also we're working with community energy groups as well that's helping us make sure that we bring resident voice into the overall process. So I think, just when if you're thinking about that, setting the right specification, setting and attracting the right partner is really critical. And then, as I said, who you plan with makes a difference. So we started from the outset again with a sub-regional approach, which enabled us to pool resources. We also look to bring on external support to aid the boroughs in coming together. There's 4 of us to collaborate across 4 boroughs to capture information across multiple different departments. So I think it's a false economy at the outset to not budget internally to be able to get the most out of the process. Often we're looking at just trying to get the analysis done, but really you need to have the right skills and capabilities to really meaningfully engage in the process through the outset. The other thing I would say, I mentioned earlier on is around the kind of terminology that's used. We call this the Southeast London Energy Plan, not local energy planning phase 2, which is, the kind of typical kind of terminologies. And so we're trying to be really thoughtful from the branding from the outset, and also how we engage with different departments on what is this all about, what does it mean for you. And so building that ownership, we've got, as I mentioned earlier, we've got a new administration in place as well, and we'll be bringing them into the process. And having really, it's been quite enjoyable for me to have these quite in-depth conversations about the real choices and trade-offs if you prioritize this kind of intervention over another intervention. What does that mean from an overall CapEx perspective, or what does that mean from a running cost perspective, or what does that mean from fuel poverty perspective, and where do you focus and prioritize? So, I mean, those things have been really, really interesting at the outset. As we've mentioned, we're still in the midst of the project, but being able to be really iterative and have something that is also dynamic and moves with a context that's very rapidly changing has felt really important thus far.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful. And in terms of the delivery point of view, we as the delivery team has also, learned an awful lot about this process as well. We've been delivering leaps for individual local authorities, but having 4 local authorities and developing these plans together for some region, it's a different kind of beast. And in terms of developing those actual technical models as well, for example, which I said at the beginning is not really our core focus, is more about practitioner-led approach, but we still have to build those trajectories and simulations and models. And we internally just there's lots of lessons learned for us how we could make that process itself, from data handling and the interpretation of those discussions that we have, and using that more like qualitative type information and build that into a technical model. Those kind of technical challenges that we still grappling, and there's going to be an awful lot that we learn through this project that we can implement perhaps at the next leap that we are going to be working on. So before we close, I think we can kind of reach towards the end of our sessions. I think it's worth sort of highlighting that many of these challenges that we discussed today are of course not unique to Southeast London. Across many of our projects, working with public sector organisations, we're seeing very similar themes emerging: the need for greater clarity around roles and responsibilities, the importance of organisational capabilities, and ultimately the need to develop plans that can generally support decision making and implementation as well. An important subject that we haven't had the chance to talk about today and discuss is about how to bring local communities along the net zero journey. There were some really interesting presentations on that particular topic earlier today. I personally feel that resident engagement and storytelling aspect is quite often undervalued in this project, and it's again something that we working on in Celeb. We do have a company who's helping with us repowering London. Although I'm really glad that we had the chance to talk about the benefits of collaboration. Not just in Celeb again, but in many other projects, we're seeing how working across these administrative boundaries can identify common challenges, opportunities. The shared learning aspects is super important as well, and potentially unlocking those wider sub-regional opportunities rather than trying to sort of cherry pick those very local opportunities within those individual boundaries as well. So of course this project is still ongoing. I think we plan to complete it around later this year, around this December. So continuing to learn alongside the participating boroughs as well, but hopefully today's discussions provided some useful reflections on the progress so far and some of the lessons that we learned. So.
This process, if there is one?
Yeah, absolutely. So we probably both can respond to that. One of the things that we're looking at is, as Akash said, we're working with an organization called Repowering, and we are looking at basically bringing them into the process to help identify and co-develop some of the solutions and the ways that residents and communities can get involved in the delivery of that. And so we looked at a few different models with Repowering of how you do that in a meaningful way. I think one of the things is trying to get the balance right of where communities come into the process, and we had quite extensive discussions about that, because on the one hand, we didn't want to set expectations that there was a delivery plan and everything was funded and then you go ahead and take it forward, and we also didn't want to start at a process where it was quite high level and difficult for them to engage in. And so we looked at then bringing in representatives from across the 4 boroughs, and we haven't actually talked about it as much because we haven't started that process of the project yet. It's been more on the modeling side. But as we start to kind of finish off the modeling side and start doing the project and the business case identification, that's the role that we're looking to really more substantively engage with communities. How do we make sure that they're accessible, they're the right ones, they're locally adopted, owned, and that there's a role for communities within that? So we'll have a group of representative community members from our 4 boroughs to participate in that process over a set period of time as we're doing the solution development.
Thanks for the talk. It's really challenging, right, to balance a local borough with a global issue. So I'm curious, how do you weigh or balance mitigation issues like cooling a borough, right, planting trees or other things, I don't know what, versus like emissions reductions, which you're trying to do both? What percentage of the energy goes into one versus the other? And when you do engage with the community, where is the emphasis going to be?
Yeah, it's a really tricky thing to get right, and I think that's something that what we're trying to do within identifying the choices and trade-offs is have those questions come to the fore, and that would be things like looking at where there's also other benefits for doing this and doing it at the right time. So one of the examples I think that I think is quite interesting. So we have a heat network proposal that's actually being looked at for the area, and having done the analysis, if there is a heat network in the area, it's actually 50% cheaper than each of the buildings doing individual air source heat pump solutions. But they're on different timelines. They might have different needs. Some might want cooling, some might want high temperature. So there's then this role that individual preferences doesn't necessarily marry up to actually what's the best for the area as an overall outcome or an overall solution. And I think local authorities have a really important role to play in being able, because they're really some of the only operators that can say, actually, we need to not just look at individual building choices and so forth, but we need to be thinking about how this benefits the wider area, and it has wider benefits from reducing pressure on the grid, from bringing down energy costs, from costing less overall, and massive air quality improvements up in the area if done appropriately. And I think when you're looking at how you divvy up scarce resources, a lot of it comes down to making those kind of cost-benefit analysis and making sure that people understand what are the choices and trade-offs when you're doing that. Because the reality is, as you said, it's a global issue, and we need a huge amount of action to be done globally. But if we were thinking quite tactically and pragmatic, we can have all these other benefits while contributing to reducing carbon emissions, while improving air quality. And I think we still have to be doing both. I mean, days like today show that we can't focus on just carbon emissions or reducing carbon emissions or improving adaptation.
And I guess also about the cross-department collaboration, that's when it comes in, is how important between the different teams within a local authority to communicate and discuss these projects. Because let's say maybe the energy team developing a big heat network project, they're very familiar with that scheme, but perhaps, planning, housing, and the people who are engaging with those local communities should be communicating with those teams. So that's again just some experience working with local authorities can be an issue often, that teams working in silos, so breaking those silos is an important area.
Thanks for that. How are you upskilling your team to enable you deliver on your strategy?
Yeah. That's a very good question. I would say a lot of it comes down to also trying to have a stepwise approach to it. So I think when you're looking at upskilling, one, there is the kind of general knowledge. Do people know this is an issue and why this is an issue? And we're just looking at the need for tackling the climate crisis. And so we tend to do the kind of carbon literacy, local type training across, making that available to all of our officers as well as to all of our counselors. And that then is really trying to take the global issue and say, okay, what are we have as local levers to actually do something about this in our borough and in our area, and making it tangible for people. And then I think within that, there's the much more, okay, well, within housing, what's the skill set that you need to actually make sure we have folks that are retrofitting properties, not reinstalling gas boilers. We've got low carbon technicians and so forth, or in planning that you have people that have sufficient understanding to be able to understand, how to vet heat network proposals that come in, or thinking about, forward planning from that perspective. I think the skill set might be quite different across different departments, and so making sure that there's an understanding around what the ambition is and why we're doing it is really critical as a base level. And then tactically, when you're doing big projects, starting to invest in and building up that capacity. I think also using supply chain procurement and making sure that actually is our supply chain fit for supporting us for the kinds of changes that we want to make is really important. But certainly it's an industry-wide issue that requires a much wider response to ensure there's trainings and support out there.